My name is Martha, and until recently, I hadn't thought about life as anything other than a quiet, solitary affair. When I lost my husband George nearly 5 years ago, I was sure that chapter of romance, or companionship for that matter, was closed. After all, we'd built a good life together, and though we never had children, I'd felt our home was complete. That was until the day my niece Kate called, asking if her son, my grandnephew Ryan, could stay with me for the summer. At 65, I was well past the days of fretting over what to do with young people. But Kate was in a bind. Ryan needed a place to regroup, she said, to focus, to figure things out before his last year of college. And she had always respected me, trusting that my years of teaching literature would bring some stability and structure back into his life. After some hesitation, I agreed, deciding that a little company wouldn't be so bad. The house had been too quiet for too long, and I wondered what it would be like to fill it, if even just for a few months, with a new presence. When Ryan arrived, I was struck by how much he'd changed. The last time I'd seen him, he'd been a lanky 16-year-old with big dreams and little direction. Now, at 23, he stood at the door, a man with broad shoulders, strong hands, and a thoughtful expression that hinted at maturity beyond his years. His dark hair was cropped short, and his piercing blue eyes held a quiet intelligence. I found myself momentarily taken aback by his appearance, but quickly shook off the thought. This was my nephew, after all. Yet something about his presence immediately changed the energy in the house. Ryan didn't waste time settling in. He offered to help with household chores, and even found himself in the garden with me on the weekends, working tirelessly as I pruned the roses. It wasn't long before our quiet dinners turned into lengthy conversations. He had grown thoughtful, considerate, even charming in a way I hadn't expected. The way he spoke about his studies, his interest in architecture, and his dreams of building something meaningful reminded me of the passion I once had in my youth. One night, as we sat together over a glass of wine, I found myself drawn in by his stories. He described a project he'd worked on, one where he'd designed a small, eco-friendly home for an underfunded community. As he spoke, I could see his eyes light up with that spark I once recognized in myself. It was endearing, yes, but also startling. I was drawn to his enthusiasm, reminded of my younger self. And that's when I felt it. A small, fleeting warmth rising in my chest, one I hadn't experienced in years. I pushed the feeling away quickly. After all, what was this? Admiration? A harmless attraction to youth and vigor? But a part of me knew it was more complicated. I reminded myself of the boundary between us, a line that should never be crossed. I was his aunt, for heaven's sake. Yet, I felt myself slipping. The days began to flow in a strange rhythm. Ryan would rise early to go jogging, and I'd find myself in the kitchen, preparing breakfast, wondering when I had last felt so eager for company. Over time, our conversations grew warmer, and our interactions became subtly charged. There were small things, a lingering touch as he handed me a coffee cup, a glance that held just a moment too long. I noticed the way his hand brushed mine in the hallway, or how his gaze would settle on me across the dinner table. And then came the night of the storm. A sudden downpour had knocked out the electricity, casting the house into a heavy silence as we fumbled around for candles. Ryan lit a few in the living room, placing them on the coffee table as the two of us sat, listening to the rain pounding on the windows. It was a comforting sound, one that filled the silence between us. In the flickering candlelight, he looked at me with a softness I hadn't seen before. "Aunt Martha," he began, his voice low and hesitant. "Thank you for letting me stay. I know it's probably been a bit strange for you having me around like this." "Oh, it's not strange at all," I replied, waving away his words, trying to keep the conversation light. "It's been a pleasure, really. The house, it feels warmer with you here." He smiled, and I felt a warmth creep up my neck. The words had come out more honest than I intended, and I wondered if he noticed the small tremor in my voice. Ryan looked down at his hands, seemingly lost in thought. "Sometimes," he said after a pause, "I feel like I don't really belong anywhere. Not at home, not at school. It's like I'm just floating, you know?" I did know. That feeling was all too familiar. The sense of being caught between places, of wanting something more, something intangible. I reached over, resting my hand on his. It was meant to be a comforting gesture, but as our fingers touched, I felt a jolt run through me. He didn't pull away, and instead he turned his hand over, letting my fingers intertwine with his. For a long moment, we stayed like that, neither of us daring to move. I knew, deep down, that I should let go, that this was crossing into a realm of intimacy that shouldn't exist between us. But I didn't pull away. In that brief touch, in that silence filled only by the rain, I felt alive again in a way I hadn't in years. When I finally withdrew my hand, I felt my heart pounding. I looked away, pretending to adjust the blanket on my lap, anything to avoid the look in his eyes. Maybe we both needed this," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The storm had long passed, yet the memory of that night lingered in my mind, haunting me. I'd tried to convince myself that it was all innocent. A simple moment of compassion in a storm, nothing more. But every time I passed Ryan in the hallway or caught a glimpse of him reading on the porch, the sensation of his hand in mine echoed back with an unsettling intensity. Days slipped by with a steady rhythm of shared meals and quiet companionship. I found myself looking forward to his presence in the mornings as we sipped coffee together, discussing everything from the latest news to his thoughts on urban architecture. Sometimes, our conversations drifted into more personal territory. My late husband, his academic struggles, our mutual longing for purpose. And in these intimate exchanges, I caught myself studying him with more than just familial affection. One afternoon, we were working side by side in the garden, pulling weeds from the vegetable patch. The sun was bright, casting a warm glow over the yard, and I was thankful for the distraction of gardening to keep my thoughts in check. "I think you're better at this than I am," he joked, looking over at me, sweat beading on his forehead. He paused, pulling off his gloves and wiping his brow with the back of his hand. "Well, years of practice," I replied with a chuckle, trying to keep my voice steady. But as he leaned back on his heels, watching me with that familiar, quiet intensity, I felt my pulse quicken. "Can I ask you something, Aunt Martha?" His tone had shifted to something softer, more serious. "Of course." I looked up, curious and a bit nervous. "Do you ever wonder if you might have done things differently? I mean, if you could go back and change things in your life?" The question took me by surprise. Of course I'd wondered. Losing George had left me with a void I hadn't yet managed to fill. Despite my best efforts to move forward. But to hear it from him, in such a tender, unguarded way, made me feel less alone in my own regrets. "Sometimes," I said, choosing my words carefully, "I suppose we all have those thoughts, don't we? About paths not taken, things left unsaid." Ryan nodded slowly, his gaze dropping to the ground as he seemed to consider my answer. "I feel like I'm at a crossroads, and I don't even know which way to go." "You're still so young, Ryan. There's plenty of time to figure things out," I offered, trying to reassure him. But he looked up sharply, and the intensity in his eyes startled me. "It doesn't feel that way," he murmured. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he added, "Sometimes I feel like I want things that I shouldn't." The words hung in the air between us, heavy and unresolved. I felt a shiver run down my spine, the weight of his gaze pressing on me as the truth of his words settled in. I wanted to respond, to ease the tension, but my mind was a chaotic swirl of thoughts and emotions. I wasn't sure what he was implying, yet a part of me understood all too well. After that conversation in the garden, something shifted between us. We danced around each other carefully, like magnets drawn together, yet afraid of colliding. I found myself hyper-aware of his every movement, every gesture. When he walked into the kitchen, I could sense his presence even without turning to look. In the quiet evenings, as we shared a glass of wine or watched an old film, the silence between us felt loaded, brimming with words unsaid and desires unacknowledged. One evening, we were sitting in the living room watching an old black-and-white film that had been one of George's favorites. Ryan was sprawled out on the couch, his arm draped over the backrest, while I sat in my usual armchair, trying to focus on the screen instead of him. But when he laughed at a particularly witty line, I couldn't resist looking over at him. He caught my gaze and held it, his expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the faint light from the television casting shadows across his face. My heart thudded in my chest, each beat louder than the last. "You have this?" "Look, sometimes," he said quietly, his voice barely above a murmur. "Like you're somewhere else, like you're thinking of something you can't tell me." I felt a blush creeping up my cheeks, flustered by how well he seemed to know me already. "Maybe I am," I replied, hoping my voice didn't betray my nervousness. Ryan tilted his head, his gaze never wavering. "You can tell me anything, you know? I won't judge you." The sincerity in his words took my breath away, and for a moment I wondered if I could trust him with the thoughts I'd been suppressing. But no, it was too dangerous, too risky. I couldn't let myself go down that path, no matter how tempting it felt. Still, the words slipped out before I could stop them. I think about what my life would be like if things had turned out differently. Ryan leaned forward, his eyes searching mine. "And what do you see?" I swallowed, feeling my heart race. I see myself feeling free and happy, but it's just a fantasy." "Why does it have to be?" he whispered, his voice thick with something that made my skin tingle. He reached out, his hand hovering just inches from mine. The space between us felt electric, and I could feel his warmth, his presence drawing me in. I wanted to pull away, to tell him to stop, but something inside me held me there, frozen and captivated. His fingers brushed mine, the slightest touch sending a thrill up my arm, and I felt my resolve beginning to crumble. For the first time in years, I felt alive, desired, seen. But just as quickly as the moment had arrived, it was over. I pulled my hand away, standing up abruptly, my heart pounding in my chest. I think I need some fresh air," I stammered, not daring to look at him as I made my way to the door. I could feel his gaze following me, and part of me wanted him to reach out, to stop me. But he didn't, and I slipped outside into the cool night air, my thoughts a chaotic whirl. The following days passed in a blur of confusion and self-doubt. I tried to avoid Ryan as much as possible, burying myself in gardening and household chores to distract myself from the longing that gnawed at me. But no matter how hard I tried to push it away, the memory of his touch, of that charged moment, lingered like a forbidden melody. Sophie called one afternoon, sensing something was amiss. We'd been friends for over 40 years, and there was little I could hide from her. "Martha, you sound distracted," she observed, her voice tinged with concern. "Is everything all right?" I hesitated, unsure how much I could confide, but the need to unburden myself was overwhelming. "Ryan, he's been staying with me, helping around the house," I began slowly. "And well, it's been complicated." "Complicated?" Sophie's tone sharpened, and I could almost picture her raising an eyebrow in suspicion. "Martha, don't tell me you're getting attached." I bit my lip, struggling to find the right words. "It's not like that," I insisted, though even I didn't fully believe it. "It's just, he's so different from what I expected. I find myself feeling things I haven't felt in a long time." Sophie was silent for a moment, and I braced myself for a lecture. But when she spoke, her voice was gentle, understanding. "Listen, Martha, you've been alone for a long time, and it's natural to crave companionship. But be careful. You're playing with fire, my friend." Her words echoed in my mind long after we hung up. I knew she was right, of course. I was treading on dangerous ground, letting myself get swept away by emotions I'd long since buried. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't seem to let go of the longing that had taken hold of my heart. The days stretched into an intoxicating blend of quiet moments, stolen glances, and late-night silences that spoke louder than words. I tried to distance myself, to preserve the boundaries that had begun to blur. But some part of me kept pulling back to him, like a moth to a flame. There was a magnetism between us, undeniable and growing stronger by the day. One evening, after a long day of working in the garden and sorting through some of George's old things in the attic, Ryan suggested we unwind with a glass of wine on the porch. The evening air was warm, thick with the scent of summer blooms, and I felt my resolve softening as we settled into our chairs, gazing out over the darkening landscape. "You know," he said after a long silence, swirling the wine in his glass, "it feels like I've known you my whole life, Aunt Martha, in a way that's different from anyone else." I glanced at him, feeling a familiar warmth rise in my chest. "We do have a connection, Ryan," I replied, choosing my words carefully. "But it's a complicated one." He turned to look at me, his face softened by the glow of the porch light. "What makes it so complicated?" he asked, his voice quiet, his gaze unwavering. "Ryan," I began, but my voice faltered. How could I explain the lines I knew we were crossing without sounding like I was contradicting my own desires? Because it isn't meant to be like this. You're my nephew." He reached out, placing a hand on my arm, his touch warm and grounding. "Does it really matter, Aunt Martha?" His voice was a whisper, but the sincerity in his eyes cut through me like a blade. Maybe we're here for a reason, at this time, in this place." I searched his face, torn between my need to keep things as they were and the overwhelming desire that had been building inside me. I wanted to believe him, to let go of the fear that held me back. But some part of me still clung to my sense of propriety, to the carefully crafted life I'd led up until now. He must have sensed my hesitation, because he gently pulled his hand back, offering a sad, almost resigned smile. "I don't want to make you uncomfortable," he murmured, his voice barely audible. I looked at him, feeling a pang of guilt mixed with an intense, almost desperate longing. "It's not that," I said quickly. "It's just, I don't know what's right anymore." For a moment we sat in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. And then, almost as if by some unspoken agreement, we both leaned in at the same time, our faces inches apart. I could feel his breath warm against my skin, his gaze holding mine as the world around us faded into nothingness. And then finally, our lips met in a soft, tentative kiss, a brush of warmth and softness that sent a thrill through my entire body. It was a kiss unlike any I had ever experienced, filled with both a quiet reverence and an undeniable passion, as if we were both afraid to break the spell. We pulled away after a moment, both of us breathing heavily, our eyes locked in silent understanding. No words were necessary. The kiss had said everything we hadn't dared to voice. And though a part of me knew we were treading on dangerous ground, I also knew that there was no going back. The days that followed felt like a dream, a surreal, beautiful dream where reality held little sway. Ryan and I shared more moments like that, brief but electrifying, each kiss, each touch leaving me feeling more alive than I had in years. But even as we grew closer, the shadow of guilt hung over me, whispering warnings I was too afraid to heed. One afternoon, as I was preparing dinner, Sophie called again. Her voice held a hint of concern as she asked about my time with Ryan. I tried to keep my tone light, to reassure her that everything was fine, but she wasn't easily convinced. "Martha," she said firmly, "I know you, and I can tell something's going on. You sound different." I hesitated, feeling a pang of anxiety at the thought of confiding in her, but I knew I couldn't keep it hidden forever. Taking a deep breath, I told her, cautiously, vaguely, about the bond that had formed between Ryan and me, though I left out the more intimate details. She was silent for a long time, and when she finally spoke, her voice was filled with both sympathy and caution. "Martha, you're a grown woman, and I can't tell you what to do. But be careful. Feelings can be powerful, and sometimes they lead us down paths we don't expect." Her words lingered in my mind long after we hung up, and as I turned back to the kitchen, I felt a renewed sense of doubt. Was I truly in control of my actions, or was I letting my emotions cloud my judgment? That night, as Ryan and I sat together in the living room, I felt the weight of Sophie's warning pressing down on me. He noticed my unease, and after a few minutes, he turned to me, his brow furrowed in concern. "Is something wrong?" he asked, his voice gentle. I hesitated, unsure how to explain the turmoil I felt inside, but I knew I couldn't keep it bottled up forever. Taking a deep breath, I looked at him, my voice trembling as I spoke. "Ryan, I don't know if this is right. I keep thinking about what people would say if they knew about us." He reached out, taking my hand in his touch warm and reassuring. "Does it matter what people think?" he asked softly. What we have, it feels real to me." I looked down, my heart aching with both love and fear. "It does feel real," I whispered, "but I'm afraid. I'm afraid of what it means and what it could cost us." He squeezed my hand gently, his eyes filled with understanding. "I don't want to hurt you, Aunt Martha, and I don't want you to do anything that feels wrong to you, but I also don't want to lose this, whatever it is we have." His words struck a chord deep within me, and I felt tears prickling at the corners of my eyes. I knew he was right, that what we had was something rare and beautiful, something worth cherishing. But I also knew that the world was not kind to those who defied its conventions, and I wasn't sure if I was strong enough to face the consequences. In the days that followed, I wrestled with my conflicting feelings, torn between the desire to hold on to Ryan and the fear of the consequences. Every time I looked at him, I felt my resolve weakening, my heart pulling me closer to him, despite my misgivings. One evening, as we sat together in the quiet of the living room, he looked at me with a tenderness that made my heart ache. "I don't want to make things harder for you," he murmured, his voice filled with sincerity. If you want me to go, I'll understand. I'll do whatever you need." The thought of losing him was unbearable, and I felt a surge of panic at the idea. But I also knew that I couldn't continue living in this state of constant uncertainty and fear. I needed to make a choice, one way or the other. Taking a deep breath, I looked at him, my heart heavy with the weight of my decision. Maybe it's time," I said quietly, my voice filled with sadness. He nodded slowly, his expression filled with understanding and sorrow. "I'll go if that's what you want," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. As he packed his things the next morning, I felt a sense of emptiness settling over me, a hollow ache that I knew would take a long time to heal. But I also felt a sense of relief, a weight lifted from my shoulders as I made peace with my decision. And as I watched him drive away, I knew that I had done what was right, even if it broke my heart. After Ryan left, the house seemed unbearably silent. I had lived alone for years, but now the solitude felt heavier. Every room held a reminder of him, the creak in the floorboards where he'd pace while on the phone with friends, the faint smell of his cologne that lingered in the living room, and the books he'd left behind on the shelves, his bookmarks tucked between the pages. I spent the first few days in a haze, drifting from room to room, unable to settle. Each day, I found myself glancing at the driveway, half hoping to see his car pull back in. I knew it was foolish, but I couldn't shake the emptiness that had settled in my chest. Sophie called often, checking in on me, her voice a soothing reminder of the world outside. She didn't press me for details, but I could hear the concern in her tone, the gentle reminders that life would move on, that time would eventually smooth over the ache in my heart. But deep down, I knew that it wasn't just time I needed. I needed closure, a way to make sense of what had happened, to understand why I had let myself fall so deeply, so recklessly, into something I knew could never last. One evening, I sat on the porch with a glass of wine watching the sunset as memories of our time together washed over me. I thought of his laughter, the way his eyes would light up when he spoke about his dreams, the quiet moments we'd shared that had made me feel young and alive again. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I let out a long sigh, realizing that maybe, just maybe, I hadn't fallen in love with him entirely. Perhaps it was the feeling he awakened in me, the reminder of a part of myself that I'd long buried, the part of me that yearned for companionship, for connection, for the thrill of something new. In that moment, I understood that what I had felt wasn't wrong. It had been a catalyst, a spark that had reignited something inside me, reminding me of the capacity to feel deeply, even at this stage in my life. Several weeks passed, and slowly I began to find peace with the experience. I threw myself into my gardening, spent time with Sophie, and even joined a local book club to reconnect with the community. But there were still moments, quiet nights, when the loneliness crept back in, and I'd catch myself reaching for my phone, tempted to call him, to hear his voice just once more. One afternoon, while shopping for groceries, I was startled by the sight of someone who looked remarkably like Ryan, standing just a few feet away in the produce aisle. My heart skipped a beat, and for a moment I felt that familiar thrill, that sense of longing. But as I looked closer, I realized it wasn't him, just someone with the same tall frame, the same dark hair. I felt a pang of disappointment, but also a strange sense of relief. It was as though the universe was reminding me that he was gone, that I needed to let go and move forward. Later that night, as I sat alone in my quiet house, I realized that I had already begun to heal. I could think of him now without the sharp ache in my chest, without the overwhelming sense of loss. Instead, I felt a gentle warmth, a fondness for the memories we'd shared, and a quiet acceptance of what had been and what could never be. Months turned into seasons, and by the time winter rolled around, I had settled into a comfortable routine. The pain of Ryan's absence had faded, replaced by a sense of peace and gratitude. I knew now that his visit had been a gift, a reminder of the beauty of life, the joy of connection, and the importance of allowing oneself to feel, even if it meant risking heartache. One afternoon, while attending a holiday gathering with Sophie, I met someone new. A man named Henry, a retired professor with a gentle smile and an easy laugh. We struck up a conversation, and I found myself genuinely enjoying his company, feeling a spark of interest that surprised me. As we spoke, I thought of Ryan, of the journey that had brought me to this moment, and I realized that I was ready to move forward. The experience with Ryan had opened my heart, reminded me of my capacity for connection and affection, and now I felt prepared to embrace whatever the future held. Henry and I exchanged numbers, and as I walked back to my car that evening, I felt a renewed sense of hope, a lightness I hadn't felt in years. The year after Ryan's visit, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened, on the ways it had changed me. I had grown in ways I hadn't anticipated, learning to embrace life's uncertainties, to open myself to new experiences, and to let go of the past. Every so often, I'd still think of Ryan. A fleeting memory, a passing thought. I wondered if he ever thought of me, if he remembered those quiet moments we'd shared. But I no longer felt the ache of longing, no longer felt the need to hold on to something that was meant to be temporary. Instead, I felt grateful for the time we'd spent together, for the way he had helped me rediscover a part of myself I'd thought was gone. And as I sat on the porch, watching the sunset on a cool autumn evening, I knew that I was finally at peace. Life had a way of surprising us, of leading us down unexpected paths, but I had learned to trust the journey, to accept the beauty and the pain that came with it. And as the sky turned shades of pink and gold, I smiled, knowing that I was ready for whatever came next. 2 years had passed since Ryan's summer visit. The seasons had come and gone, each leaving its mark on the old New England house that I had slowly come to appreciate in a new way. Life had softened around the edges. Its once sharp pains had dulled, replaced by a quiet sense of contentment. Henry and I had continued to see each other, our companionship growing into something I hadn't anticipated. We shared many evenings together, filled with warm conversations and comfortable silences, both of us understanding the importance of giving each other space to breathe and be ourselves. I no longer sought the intensity of young passion, nor the thrill of the unknown. What I had now was different, steady, gentle, and deeply fulfilling. One brisk autumn afternoon, as I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, watching the leaves drift down in shades of amber and crimson, I thought of Ryan. I didn't dwell on him often, but every so often, memories of that summer would drift back to me, tinged with a soft nostalgia. I wondered where he was now, what he was doing. Part of me hoped he had found his direction, had discovered the answers he'd been searching for. In a way, I felt he had left me with more than just memories. He had given me the courage to let go of my past, to open myself to new experiences, even at this stage of my life. I took a sip of my tea, breathing in the crisp air, feeling the cool breeze brush against my skin. The world felt different now, not in the way it had that summer, with its electric charge and unspoken desires, but in a way that was peaceful, steady. I felt grounded, connected to myself and my life in a way that I hadn't before. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow across the yard, I smiled, feeling a quiet joy that I hadn't known was possible. Life had brought me unexpected challenges, moments of intense passion and deep reflection, but it had also brought me to this place of peace. And as I watched the last rays of sunlight fade into twilight, I knew that I was ready for whatever came next. Content in the knowledge that I had lived, loved, and grown in ways I never could have imagined. It wasn't supposed to happen. It was just an awkward, fleeting moment, one I could easily explain away. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. The movie theater was dark, and Chloe had begged me to tag along with her and James, her boyfriend of 6 months. She claimed it would be fun, a way for me to get out of the house, but I knew better. She thought I was lonely, and maybe I was. When we got there, the seats were scattered. Chloe ended up a row behind us, chatting with a coworker she'd bumped into while James and I found seats near the center. I was about to settle into the seat beside him when someone brushed past, claiming the spot. "Just sit here," James said, patting his lap with an easy grin. I froze. "It's fine," he added quickly, lowering his voice. "Just until Chloe gets here." I hesitated for a beat too long, my heart racing, but I told myself it was harmless. It was dark, no one would notice, and besides it was just a seat, so I sat. I didn't think it would mean anything. But the second I felt his hands lightly resting on my hips to steady me, my body betrayed me. His touch was casual, but the heat of it lingered through the thin fabric of my dress. The movie started, but I couldn't focus. My breathing felt uneven, and my pulse was loud in my ears, drowning out the dialogue on screen. When Chloe finally shuffled down the aisle, squeezing into the seat next to me, I practically leapt off James's lap, mumbling some excuse about saving his spot. If she noticed anything odd, she didn't show it. But James did. I caught his eyes during the movie, and he didn't look away. That moment should have been nothing, a mistake we'd laugh about later. But the way his gaze lingered told me we'd crossed a line I wasn't sure we could uncross. The incident at the movie theater stayed with me far longer than it should have. It wasn't just the moment itself, awkward as it was what it revealed. James wasn't just my daughter's boyfriend anymore. He had a presence, a pull, that made it impossible for me to look at him the same way again. And worse, I knew he felt it too. It's strange, isn't it? How something so simple can spiral into something much bigger. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But that night after the movie, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt the heat of his hands on my hips, the firmness of his thighs beneath me, and the quiet intensity in his gaze. When I finally drifted off, it was morning before I knew it. I woke up groggy, annoyed at myself for dwelling on it. But when I walked into the kitchen and found James standing there, pouring coffee like he'd always belonged in my house, all those feelings came rushing back. He looked up, catching my eye, and smiled. It wasn't a big smile, just a small quirk of his lips, but it was enough to set my pulse racing. "Morning," he said, his voice smooth, casual. "Morning," I replied, reaching for a mug and busying myself with the coffee pot. I tried to act normal, like my skin wasn't prickling under his gaze. "Chloe's still asleep," he said, leaning against the counter. "Late night," I muttered, avoiding his eyes. "Yeah," he said, and then, after a pause, "You okay? You seem distracted." I froze, gripping the mug a little tighter than necessary. "I'm fine," I said quickly, forcing a smile. "Just tired." He didn't push it, but I could feel his eyes on me as I left the kitchen. James had started dating Chloe 6 months ago. She'd met him at some networking event for young professionals. Her words, not mine. Chloe was ambitious, sharp, and as confident as you'd expect a 22-year-old fresh out of college to be. When she brought James home for the first time, I was surprised. He was older than most of the boys she'd dated, 25, polished and charming in a way that felt effortless. He was the kind of man who remembered everyone's name, who could make you laugh without trying too hard. I liked him immediately. Too much, maybe. At first, I brushed it off. Of course I liked him. He was polite, respectful, and clearly smitten with my daughter. But as time went on, I started noticing things I shouldn't have. The way his hand would linger on mine when he passed me something at the dinner table. The way his eyes seemed to find me across the room, holding my gaze just a second longer than they should. The way his compliments, always polite and casual, felt like they carried an undertone, meant just for me. "Mrs. Raines, I can't believe you're Chloe's mom," he'd said once, laughing as he helped me clear the table after dinner. "You don't look old enough to have a daughter her age." I'd laughed it off, calling him a charmer, but my cheeks had burned. I told myself it was harmless. Flirting, if you could even call it that, didn't mean anything. He was young, confident, of course he was friendly. But deep down, I knew there was something more. And then there was the movie night. After that, everything changed. A week after the theater incident, Chloe asked me to let James in while she ran late from work. It was a rainy evening, and when the doorbell rang, I found him standing there, his dark hair slick with rain, and his coat dripping on the porch. "Sorry," he said, flashing me that easy smile. "Didn't mean to interrupt your evening." "It's fine," I said, stepping aside to let him in. He shrugged off his coat, handing it to me, and for a moment his fingers brushed mine. It was nothing, just a small touch, but it felt like a spark had shot up my arm. "You can wait in the living room," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Chloe should be back soon." Instead, he followed me into the kitchen, leaning against the counter as I poured myself a glass of wine. "Want one?" I asked, holding up the bottle. "Sure," he said, his voice low. I handed him the glass, and he held it up in a mock toast. "To awkward movie nights," he said, smirking. I nearly choked on my sip. "Don't," I said, laughing despite myself. "What?" he asked, feigning innocence. "It's a funny memory." "It's embarrassing," I said, shaking my head. "For who?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. The question hung in the air, heavier than it should have been. I didn't answer, and he didn't push. But as he took a sip of his wine, his eyes stayed on me, unblinking. I knew I should have walked away, made an excuse to leave the room. But I didn't. I stayed, leaning against the counter across from him, the silence between us crackling with tension. "You're different from most people I've met," he said suddenly, his voice soft. I frowned, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," he said, swirling the wine in his glass. You carry yourself differently, like you know exactly who you are." The compliment caught me off guard, and for a moment I didn't know how to respond. "I guess that comes with age," I said finally, trying to brush it off. "Maybe," he said, his gaze steady. "But I think it's more than that." My heart was pounding, and I hated how much his words affected me. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but before I could, he reached out, his hand brushing against mine. It was a small gesture, barely more than a touch, but it sent a jolt through me. I froze, staring at him, and for a moment the world seemed to tilt. James, I started, my voice trembling, but the sound of Chloe's car pulling into the driveway broke the moment like a snap. He pulled his hand back, his expression unreadable, and I turned away, busying myself with the wine bottle as Chloe walked in, calling out a cheerful hello. That moment should have been a warning, a sign to put distance between us before it was too late. But instead, it became the first crack in the wall I'd spent years building. I don't know exactly when the line blurred. Maybe it was that night in the kitchen, his hand brushing against mine, or the way he looked at me with an intensity that made my stomach flip. Or maybe it had been building for weeks. Unspoken tension, disguised as harmless glances and casual conversations. All I knew was that I couldn't stop thinking about him. The moment that truly changed everything happened the following Saturday. Chloe had gone out with friends for the evening, leaving the house unusually quiet. I'd settled on the couch with a glass of wine and an old movie, trying to enjoy the rare peace. I wasn't expecting James to stop by, but when the doorbell rang, there he was. "Chloe's not here," I said, stepping aside to let him in. "I know," he said, shrugging off his jacket. "She told me she'd be out, but I figured I'd drop by anyway. Didn't want you getting lonely." His smile was casual, but his tone wasn't. I told myself he was just being polite, that I was reading too much into it. But as he followed me into the living room, his presence seemed to fill the space in a way that was impossible to ignore. "Wine?" I asked, gesturing to the bottle on the coffee table. "Sure," he said, sinking onto the couch as if he'd done it 100 times before. I poured him a glass and sat down at the other end of the couch, leaving enough space between us to keep things neutral. At least, that was the plan. "What are you watching?" he asked, nodding toward the TV. "Some old noir film," I said. "Probably before your time." He laughed softly, his eyes flicking to mine. "You're not that much older than me." I raised an eyebrow. "I'm old enough to be your mother." "But you're not," he said, his voice low. The air between us shifted, the weight of his words settling over me. I should have changed the subject, made an excuse to leave the room, but I didn't. The movie played on in the background, but neither of us was paying attention. He leaned back, his arm draped casually over the back of the couch, his gaze never leaving me. "You know," he said after a long pause, "you're different from anyone I've ever met." I laughed, trying to break the tension. "I'm sure Chloe would love to hear that." "I'm serious," he said, his tone soft but firm. You're confident, you know who you are. It's rare." I felt my cheeks flush and I looked away, swirling the wine in my glass. "You shouldn't say things like that," I murmured. "Why not?" he asked, leaning closer. "Because it's inappropriate," I said, my voice trembling. He didn't respond right away, and when I finally looked at him, his face was inches from mine. His eyes searched mine, and for a moment the world seemed to pause. "You feel it too, don't you?" he whispered. I froze, my heart pounding. "James, we can't." But before I could finish, his lips were on mine. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, as if he was waiting for me to pull away. But I couldn't. My glass slipped from my hand, landing on the carpet with a dull thud as I leaned into him, my hands gripping the front of his shirt. His touch was careful, almost reverent, and when he deepened the kiss, every rational thought vanished. "James," I whispered, breaking the kiss long enough to catch my breath. "This is..." "Don't," he said, his voice low and desperate. "Don't say it's wrong." But it was wrong, and we both knew it. That didn't stop me from pulling him closer. We didn't make it to the bedroom. The couch became our world, the flickering light of the TV casting shadows across his face as he kissed me like he'd been waiting for this moment forever. His hands explored my body with a mixture of confidence and hesitation, and for the first time in years, I felt alive. It wasn't just the physical connection, it was the way he looked at me, like I was the only person who mattered. When it was over, we lay there in silence, tangled together, the reality of what we'd done slowly sinking in. "I shouldn't have come," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "No," I said, my voice trembling. "You shouldn't have." He turned to look at me, his expression soft but conflicted. "Do you want me to leave?" I hesitated, my heart aching. "I don't know." The next morning, I woke up to find him gone. The couch was empty, the wine glasses still sitting on the coffee table. I stared at the spot where he'd been, my mind racing. I told myself it was a one-time mistake, that it wouldn't happen again. But deep down, I knew better. The days that followed were a blur of guilt and anticipation. I avoided Chloe as much as possible, afraid she'd see the truth written all over my face. But James? He was everywhere. He texted me late at night, his messages simple but loaded with meaning. Thinking about you. Can't stop. I didn't respond at first, but the longer I resisted, the more I wanted to see him again. And then he showed up at my office. It was late, long after my coworkers had gone home. I was going over design plans for a new client when the door to my office creaked open. "James?" I said, startled. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "I couldn't stay away," he said, his voice low. "You can't be here," I said, standing up. "Why not?" he asked, stepping closer. "Because this is my workplace," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. "And," he said, his eyes locking on mine. Before I could respond, he closed the distance between us, his hands finding my waist. "James, someone could." "They won't," he said, cutting me off with a kiss. That night, the small couch in my office became our refuge. The risk of being caught only heightened the intensity, and when he finally left, I sat there in the dark, my heart racing and my mind a whirlwind of emotions. I told myself it couldn't continue, that it was too dangerous, too reckless. But the next time he called, I didn't hesitate to answer. Once we crossed the line, there was no going back. It wasn't just a moment of weakness anymore. It was something much deeper, something neither of us could resist. James and I fell into a dangerous rhythm, one that blurred the lines between secrecy and obsession. We knew we were playing with fire, but every stolen moment made the flames burn brighter. It started with late-night visits to the house when Chloe wasn't home. He'd text me, something simple like, "Can I see you?" and within minutes, he'd be at the door. Each time felt riskier than the last, but the thrill of it only added to the intensity. One evening, Chloe had gone to a friend's birthday party, promising she wouldn't be home until late. James showed up an hour after she left, slipping through the back door like he belonged there. "You shouldn't keep doing this," I said as he stepped inside, his hair damp from the rain. "Neither should you," he replied, a sly grin tugging at his lips. He didn't wait for me to argue. He closed the distance between us, his hands finding my waist as he pressed me against the counter. The rain outside blurred the windows, the sound of it pounding against the glass, the only thing breaking the silence. "You make it impossible to stay away," he murmured, his lips brushing against my neck. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The places we met became more reckless. Once, we spent an afternoon in his car, parked in a secluded spot at the edge of town. The windows fogged as the summer heat made the air thick and sticky, but neither of us cared. Another time, we met at a boutique hotel on the outskirts of the city. I told Chloe I was meeting a client and left work early, my hands shaking as I walked into the lobby. James was waiting for me in the room, his tie loosened and his sleeves rolled up, and the second the door closed behind me, all the tension melted into something electric. The room was small, intimate, and every sound felt amplified. The rustle of sheets, the soft gasps, the faint hum of the air conditioner, it was all-consuming. "You drive me crazy," he said afterward, his head resting against the pillow as he traced lazy circles on my arm. I didn't respond. I couldn't bring myself to say what I was thinking, that I felt the same way. But the more time we spent together, the harder it became to keep it hidden. Chloe started noticing the way James lingered at the house, how he always seemed to find a reason to stay longer than necessary. One evening, as we sat around the dinner table, she made an offhand comment that sent a chill down my spine. "You two get along so well," she said, glancing between me and James. "Sometimes I think he likes you more than he likes me." I froze, my fork halfway to my mouth, but James didn't miss a beat. "She's just easy to talk to," he said smoothly, flashing Chloe a charming smile. "You should be glad your mom's so cool." Chloe laughed, brushing it off, but the comment lingered in the air like smoke. It wasn't just Chloe who noticed. My best friend, Evelyn, started asking questions too. "You seem different lately," she said one afternoon as we sipped coffee at a cafe downtown. "Different how?" I asked, feigning ignorance. Evelyn tilted her head, studying me. "I don't know. Distracted. Like your mind is somewhere else." I forced a laugh, shaking my head. "I think you're imagining things." "Am I?" she asked, her voice soft but probing. I avoided her gaze, focusing on the steam rising from my coffee. Evelyn didn't press further, but I could tell she wasn't convinced. The close calls started piling up, each one leaving my heart pounding and my nerves frayed. One night, after Chloe had gone to bed, James and I were sitting in the living room. The lights were dim, and we were perched on opposite ends of the couch, trying to maintain the illusion of distance. But when he reached out, his fingers brushing against mine, the room seemed to shrink. I didn't hear Chloe coming down the stairs until it was too late. "What are you two still doing up?" she asked, yawning as she stepped into the room. "Just talking," I said quickly, pulling my hand back. James smiled, his composure flawless. "Your mom's got some interesting stories," he said, leaning back casually. Chloe didn't seem to notice the tension, but I excused myself shortly after, retreating to my bedroom with my heart pounding. The worst moment came one afternoon when Raymond, my ex-husband and Chloe's father, showed up unannounced. He'd been visiting from out of state and decided to surprise Chloe, but he caught me and James in the middle of a quiet conversation in the kitchen. "What's going on here?" Raymond asked, his tone sharp. "Nothing," I said quickly, stepping away from James. "We were just talking." Raymond's eyes flicked between us, his expression hard to read. "Talking, huh?" James handled it better than I did, offering a quick explanation about helping Chloe with a project, but the tension in the room was suffocating. Despite the risks, we couldn't stop. Every touch, every kiss, every stolen moment only deepened the connection between us. It wasn't just about desire anymore. It was about the way he made me feel alive, seen, like I mattered in a way I hadn't in years. But the closer we became, the more I started to wonder how it would end. James had started talking about a future, about leaving everything behind and starting over somewhere new. "Come with me," he said one night as we lay tangled together on the couch. "We could make this work." I wanted to say yes, to believe it was possible. But the reality of what we were doing loomed over me like a storm cloud. "This can't last," I whispered, more to myself than to him. He didn't respond, but the look in his eyes told me he wasn't ready to let go. The cracks in our secret world were starting to show, and I knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. I always knew it would come to this. We were too reckless, too bold. I told myself we could keep it under control, but deep down, I knew the truth. Secrets like this never stay buried. The day it all unraveled started off like any other. Chloe had gone out for a yoga class, leaving the house quiet and still. James texted me in the morning, asking if he could stop by. I hesitated for a moment before typing back, just for a little while. When he arrived, the tension between us was already palpable. He kissed me the moment he stepped inside, his hands sliding to my waist as I tried half-heartedly to push him away. "Not here," I said, my voice trembling. "Why not?" he murmured against my neck. "It's just us." But it wasn't just us. Not really. We ended up on the couch in the living room, the same spot where everything had started. The sunlight streaming through the curtains felt almost mocking, illuminating the space that had become our secret world. I was too distracted, too caught up in him, to hear the sound of the front door opening. "Mom?" Chloe's voice froze me in place. James and I sprang apart, but it was too late. Chloe stood in the doorway, her yoga mat slung over her shoulder, her expression a mixture of confusion and growing horror. "What the hell is going on?" she asked, her voice trembling. I couldn't speak. My throat was dry, my mind racing for an explanation that wouldn't come. "Chloe," James started, stepping toward her. "Don't," she snapped, holding up a hand. "Don't you dare." Her eyes shifted to me, and the betrayal in her gaze was like a knife to the chest. "How long?" she demanded. "Chloe, it's not." "How long?" she repeated, her voice breaking. I swallowed hard, my hands trembling. It just happened. I didn't mean for this to." "You didn't mean for this to happen?" she interrupted, her voice rising. "Are you serious right now?" Tears streamed down her face as she looked between me and James. "You're my mother. How could you? How could both of you?" She didn't finish. She dropped her yoga mat and stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind her. For a moment, neither of us moved. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on me, suffocating. "I should go after her," I said finally, my voice shaking. James grabbed my arm, his grip firm but not forceful. "Give her some time," he said softly. She hates me, I whispered, tears blurring my vision. She doesn't hate you, he said, but even he didn't sound convinced. Chloe didn't come home that night. She didn't answer my calls or texts, and by the next morning, I knew she'd gone to stay with Evelyn. That was when the second blow came. Evelyn called me late that afternoon, her voice sharp and unforgiving. She told me everything, she said. I sank onto the edge of the bed, my stomach twisting. Evelyn, how could you? She interrupted, her voice trembling with anger. How could you do this to her? To yourself? I didn't mean for it to happen, I said weakly. That doesn't matter, she snapped. You betrayed her. You betrayed me. Do you have any idea what you've done? I didn't answer. What could I say? I can't do this, Lorraine, she said after a long pause. I can't stand by and watch you ruin everything. Don't call me again. The line went dead. The fallout came fast and hard. Chloe didn't just cut me out of her life. She went out of her way to make sure everyone knew what had happened. She told my colleagues, my friends, even some of my clients. The whispers started almost immediately, followed by the polite but pointed phone calls, canceling appointments. James wasn't spared either. Chloe contacted his law firm, letting them know about the affair. The details she provided were enough to get him suspended from his internship, and I could see the strain on his face every time we talked. This is my fault, I said one night as we sat in his car, parked on a quiet street. No, he said firmly. This is our fault. Don't take all the blame. But I couldn't shake the guilt. The breaking point came a week later. James showed up at my house, his face pale and drawn. I can't do this anymore, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I stared at him, my chest tightening. What do you mean? This, he said, gesturing between us. It's tearing everything apart. Chloe hates me. Your life is falling apart. And now my career. He trailed off, running a hand through his hair. Maybe we should take a break, give things time to settle. His words felt like a punch to the gut, but I nodded, knowing he was right. Okay? I said quietly. He leaned in, pressing a soft kiss to my forehead. I'm sorry, he whispered, and then he was gone. I was left with nothing but the ruins of what we'd built. Chloe didn't come home, Evelyn didn't call, and James disappeared from my life as quickly as he'd entered it. The house felt emptier than ever, and for the first time, I wondered if it had all been worth it. The silence in my house was deafening. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the absence of everything. Chloe's laughter, Evelyn's weekly check-ins, James's quiet knock on the back door. All of it was gone. For the first time in years, I was truly alone. The days blurred together. I went through the motions, waking up, making coffee, sitting at the dining table, while the morning light poured in. My phone stayed silent, save for the occasional notification about missed appointments or canceled clients. Evelyn had made good on her promise to cut ties, and Chloe didn't respond to my texts or calls. I thought I'd feel relief with James gone, but the space he left behind only made the emptiness worse. Weeks turned into months. I sold a few more houses, mostly referrals from people who hadn't yet heard the whispers about me. I poured myself into work, hoping it would distract me from the mess I'd made. But every quiet moment was a reminder of what I'd lost. One night, I sat in bed scrolling through old photos on my phone. There were pictures of Chloe from her college graduation, her beaming smile as she held her diploma. Pictures of me and Evelyn at some wine tasting event, laughing as we clinked glasses. And then there was James. The few photos of him were innocuous, group shots at family dinners, a candid of him helping Chloe set the table. But even in those pictures, I could see it. The way he looked at me. I put the phone down, closing my eyes. I wanted to hate him for what we'd done, for the chaos he'd brought into my life. But I couldn't. A letter came in the mail one gray, rainy afternoon. It was handwritten, the envelope plain and unassuming. I knew it was from him before I even opened it. Lorraine, I've thought about writing this for weeks, but I wasn't sure if I should. I wanted to give you space to let you heal. But I can't stop thinking about you. I don't regret what we had. Not for a second. You made me feel alive in ways I didn't know were possible. But I know I hurt you, and I know I hurt Chloe. I can't undo that, but I hope someday you'll find it in your heart to forgive me. I'm in Chicago now, starting over. If you ever want to talk, or anything else, you know where to find me, James. I read the letter 3 times before folding it carefully and setting it on the table. My chest ached with a mixture of longing and guilt. The next day, I picked up my phone, scrolling through my contacts until I reached Chloe's name. My finger hovered over the call button, my heart pounding. I pressed it. It rang twice before going to voicemail. "Hi, sweetheart," I said, my voice trembling. "It's me. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. For everything. I know I hurt you and I'll regret that for the rest of my life. I hope someday you can forgive me. I love you." I hung up, tears streaming down my face. James's letter stayed on the table for weeks. I thought about writing back, about hopping on a plane to Chicago and seeing if we could pick up the pieces. But every time I reached for the envelope, I stopped myself. I wasn't ready. Maybe I never would be. For now, all I could do was sit with the silence and try to figure out who I was, without him, without Chloe, without anyone. And maybe that was enough.